Hey fam, it's the Better Man podcast. We are helping men win. Speaking of winning, I want to talk about our two partners, our two sponsors that help make this show go. One is Aroga Drive. When I'm looking for day in and day out energy to keep this motor going, Aroga Drive is the one. Check them out at arogadrive.com/BetterMan. It's in the show notes. And then also our guys at Art of Homage, engaging culture in a winsome, and I'm going to tell you, a strong vibe. And if you go to the Art of Homage website, link is in the notes, we've got a code for 15% off. Just put in BetterMan15. Better Man fam, so great to be with you this week. This week's show is going to be a little different. You're not going to hear a lot of dialogue from Delario or from Manny. They're with us in studio, but we have just a special guest with us today. His name is Jim Buffington. This is his book, Betrayed by Choices. And Jim has one of those stories when you hear it, it's like a made for the big screen. But it's one of the most, I think, dramatic, sad, and then redemptive stories I've ever heard. And I was so excited to get him on the show to talk about his story, what the Lord has done in his life, and then really the epicenter of it all is forgiveness, something that so many men struggle with, past hurt, past trauma, this idea that we don't know how to forgive, aren't able to forgive. So as we jump into Jim's story, I just want to remind people that the Apostle Paul persecuted and murdered Christians, but he walked into heaven to the applause of the very people he had killed. Our God is a forgiving God. So with that, man, I'm so happy to have Jim Buffington on the show today. Jim?
Yes, sir.
Dude, it's so good to see you, bro.
You as well.
We met in a coffee shop.
We did.
Yeah, we got introduced, and then you came by the office. I watched a part of your show, and I actually watched the whole thing. Your story, just become enthralled by the whole thing, man. So why don't you just set us up? Tell us about your story, what happened, and what led you to do what you're doing today.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me. Appreciate you. It's always great to meet somebody in a coffee shop and continue getting to meet with them. So
right.
That was great. Well, I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. I'm a native Texan, and I grew up in church. My dad was minister of music, worship leader at our church. My mom was the church pianist. And I'll just be honest, I grew up very sheltered. It was about church and family. Both sets of grandparents lived in San Antonio, and that's all I knew. And I'll describe my parents. My dad's a little bit shorter, stockier guy. My mom is a tall, attractive lady, and I had a great childhood. No memories, no bad memories.
Wow.
But then about junior high school, my parents said they were getting a divorce. And back then, especially in the Baptist church, people didn't get divorced, and if you did get divorced, you were no longer the leaders. And so I didn't understand divorce. You know, divorce is just split families apart. And it's interesting. Sometimes it starts out amicable, but if there's children involved, it's always a nasty custody fight. And so that's what happened with my parents. We got bounced between my dad's house, my mom's house. A year later, we were living actually with my dad for a short time, and we were supposed to be with my mom for the weekend. Last minute change of plans, we ended up staying with some friends. My dad went out of town, and it was on a Saturday, and I was 12. My mom, the police described it this way. It was a rape and robbery that had gone badly. Apparently 2 men robbed her at gunpoint. They stole her purse. They stole her jewelry. These 2 men ripped her clothes off and raped my mom in the back seat of her car in a parking lot. And then one of them shot my mom in the face 3 times. Oh. They left her on the back seat floorboard without her clothes on. And I will tell you, when we got the news, my dad flew in the next day and shared it with us. And it was an instant fear that attached to us. And we just held on to my dad. Well, like most people, when you hear somebody's passed away, you want to go see the body. That's when it's real. So I said, we want to see Mom. So Dad took us to the funeral home. He said, you need to stay way far back because it doesn't look like her. You know, when you get shot at close range in the face 3 times, it destroyed my mom's face. She was a very attractive lady. It didn't look like her. So we had a closed casket funeral where we didn't want anybody to see her like that. We had a big photo of her in a frame, and got through the funeral, get through that, and then we're living with my dad trying to get back to normal. And I always tell people, especially if you're a victim of a homicide, there is not normal again. So we're living with my dad. A year goes by. Again, he had been a minister, but he had a side business in construction, because when you get divorced, you can't be the leader in a church. So he had a construction business, and a year later, my dad and 2 of his employees got arrested. And my dad was charged in a murder for hire scheme of capital murder and hiring these 2 men, criminal solicitation to murder my mom. We couldn't believe it. My dad denied it. I didn't do this. And so I remember everything changed when my dad was before the judge and he said, bail denied. And all of a sudden, everything changed for me. When my mom was murdered, I was a victim's kid. But when my dad was arrested, I became an offender's kid.
Wow.
And everything changes. People treat you differently. Even my own family treated us differently. And so that started the journey of prison life. And my dad ended up having a trial a few years later. He was convicted of capital murder and criminal solicitation, and the jury gave him the death penalty. So when I was 16 years old, my dad went to death row to be executed. We moved in with my parents in Arkansas. I finished high school there, then I started college at University of Arkansas. And my senior year in college, the DA secretary comes forward, and she said, there's some men in prison that shouldn't be there. And she confessed that the DA had altered evidence in my dad's case. And sure enough, she had evidence of it. My dad got a new trial. He got off death row, went back to the county jail. I graduated college. I remember taking my wife to meet my dad in the county jail. And I didn't think anything of it. I tell this to parents all the time. I took my wife to meet my dad, who I loved. Dad, this is my wife. I want you to meet who I love. I want you 2 to meet. I didn't think anything of it. My wife was terrified. She'd never been exposed to prison or jail life and all. And what I tell parents all the time, be careful what you get your kids used to.
Oh.
It's not normal to go visit your dad in prison. And so anyway, fast forward, a few years go by, and he gets his second trial. And I testified for him, and he was found guilty, but he got a life sentence, which meant he was going to be released immediately on parole because of the misconduct in the first trial, his good behavior in prison, on death row, county jail. And so I'll set the stage. My dad's found guilty. We're excited because he's coming home. Because here's what happens. If you're an inmate's family, your whole focus is how do you get that family member home? And that's what we had fought for years. And I had written my dad, called him, visited him on death row and county jail. We just wanted him to come home. So my wife and I testified, Dad could come live with me, right?
And you're still believing his innocence?
Still believing his innocence at the time. And we go to see him. So we go to the visitation room with my dad's attorney. And I had some questions that came up in the trial from the second trial because I was an adult. I was 26 years old. And Dad said, Jim, ask me anything. And so I'm going through these questions. And I get to this one particular question. And he said, I did it and she deserved it. And I looked at him. I will tell you, I felt betrayed. I felt very offended. I felt stupid that I had testified for him. And I turned on him and I said, Dad, I'll be back. And I remember going to my mom's cemetery, the tombstone, right after that. We went right to where she was buried. And I really grieved for the first time for my mom.
Wow.
Because what happens is when somebody gets arrested with my dad, the focus was all on him and the victim gets forgotten. And so I protested his parole, got his parole denied. I went back to my dad and I said, Dad, guess what? You're not getting out. You're going back to the Ellis unit at the Texas prison system and you're serving a life sentence. And I'm going to protest your parole the rest of my life, and you'll never see me again. Well, what's interesting about dads is I look like my dad. I sound like my dad. I have the same name. I'm James Jr. He's James Sr. And I remember it was right after my son was born, we had found out at that second trial, my dad had hired these two men not only to kill my mom, but to kill me and my younger brother Oscar and my younger brother Lewis. We were 12, 10, and 9. Who kills kids? My dad.
Wow.
And so I remember when my son was born, which is usually a joyous occasion, right? I remember thinking, could I ever kill my son? Because I'm just like him. You know, it's interesting how sons turn out just like their dads. Many times that's a good thing. It wasn't for me. And so I said, I've got to go see my dad one last time. So I hadn't seen him now. 4 years had gone by. I go back into the prison to see my dad. And I said, Dad, I'm just like you. I hate it. How did you go from a minister to a murderer? I need to hear your story. And so for my dad, he first thing he said was he said he was sorry for what he did to me and my brothers and my mom. And it surprised me because a lot of men, especially if they have an attitude of they're always right, they never apologize. Or if they do apologize, they're usually manipulating. Just talking about men in general. And I'm not including myself, of course. Anyway, but he apologized. And what I learned is when you apologize to somebody, the other person starts healing. And I didn't want any part of that. And I said, Dad, how did you go from happily married guy to, a killer? And so he started going through his choices that some men make of going to happy hours, hanging too long at a happy hour, cheating on my mom with another lady. My mom caught him. She said, let's get counseling and save her family. She gave him a second chance. He comes home one night late, and they get in an argument because men should come home, right? Husbands and dads come home. And they got in an argument because it was 2 a.m, and he hit her. And she said, you know what? I put up with you drinking. I put up with you cheating on me. I'm not putting up with you hitting me. I'm filing for divorce, and I'm taking the kids. Well, my dad, like a lot of men, sometimes pride's an issue. 2 things. My wife said this to my son growing up. Bad company corrupts good character. Yeah. It's biblical. Yeah. And so he's hanging out with some men in a bar that he shouldn't be with, and he says, I hate her. I wish she was dead. And because he was embarrassed that she had filed for he couldn't believe that she had the nerve to leave him. Yeah. Right? And so finally led to a conversation of, I want to be rich, free, and single, so I'm going to take out a bunch of life insurance on my wife and my 3 kids, and I'm going to kill them all. And so he hires these 2 men for $2,000 to kill me, my brother Oscar, my brother Lewis, and my mom. And what I learned from my dad is I put myself in his shoes, and I see so many men make some early choices, and I'm no different than them. It's just I can't do some of those early choices because once you make a few bad choices, the next ones get easier.
Yeah.
And so visited with him for about a year, once a month. I realized he had changed. We restored a father-son relationship, and I will say I forgave him. And people will say, how in the world could you forgive the guy that did this to your mom and tried to kill you? And all I've learned through forgiveness is the people that don't forgive, that have been hurt, they typically become bitter, angry, and depressed. And I didn't want my dad to own me like that.
Come on.
So I had to forgive my dad to let me off the hook, not to let him off the hook. And so the story ended about a year later. He had a brain aneurysm and died in prison. We claimed his body, had a private service in San Antonio, and something I knew was up. The warden was there. Wardens don't go to inmates' funerals.
Right.
And we found out that he had approved, first ever, a memorial service for my dad inside the prison, and that he wanted us and our family to attend. And I'm always kidding my wife. I take you to all the hot spots. Here, honey, we're going to prison. So we headed death row about a week later. The warden gave us a tour of death row where my dad had lived, which is an awful spot. Then we went to general population where my dad lived with his life sentence. And then we went into a prison chapel. And it's a nice chapel. And we were on the front row, and the room was full of inmates, just full of white uniformed inmates. And what I didn't know is that my dad had a job. People in prison actually have jobs. And it's interesting, many times God will restore you if you ask for forgiveness. And he became the minister of music at the chapel and the prison. And so what I didn't know was he had started this men's choir. And so we listened to these inmates sing these Christian songs. I'm like, okay. And again, I'm on the front row, and for the first man in a white prison uniform walks up to the microphone, and he looks me straight in the face, and he said, I became a Christian because your dad shared Christ with me, and it's changed my life. What we had found out is that last year of his life, he had shared with me that he truly had given his life to God and had asked for God to forgive him, taken accountability and responsibility for his actions, and was living a new life. Well, we listened for 3 hours, 300 men, one by one. I became a Christian because your dad shared Christ with me. And what we realized is my dad had changed. And here's what I learned about forgiveness. My brothers described it this way. They had not forgiven my dad. They never saw him again after that second trial when he confessed. People will, if you get hurt, you carry around suitcases of baggage of hurt and anger and betrayal and shame. And when you forgive, you get to let go of it. That doesn't mean that stuff's not, it didn't happen, but it's not attached to you. So I really do think forgiveness, I learned from my brothers, was letting go. And so since then, I started sharing our story in prisons and through a group called Victim Services, where victims come in and share their story. I speak at churches a lot, talking about the issues of forgiveness. And I will tell you, at the end of the service in my dad's chapel at the prison, the chaplain said, Jim, would you like to share with all the men? And I was not a public speaker. The men are checking out my wife. I wanted her to get out of there, And I said, okay. And I'll just be honest and transparent as I try to be. As I walked up, I turned around and I saw a bunch of men in white prison uniforms. And all I could say was, please don't judge me. I'm not judging you. You just made a bad choice that got you in prison that I haven't made. But what I learned is I forgave my dad. My dad asked me to forgive him, and I did. But a lot of men, especially in prison, but even on the outside, if they do something wrong, they can't forgive themselves. They identify. And I used in prison, you wear a label. In prison, you're a murderer, a thief, a rapist. Whatever your charge is how you're identified. And I said a word to these men, let go. You don't have to let this label define who you are. Yeah. And so forgiveness is powerful. Well, I ended up getting invited to a Bridges to Life prison ministry graduation ceremony. And at the end of the 14-week program, the inmates go to a microphone and they share how they changed. What did they learn? It looked just like my dad's memorial service. So I started volunteering 20 years ago in a prison in South Dallas at the Hutchins unit. And I sit in a small group of inmates, 10 inmates and 2 volunteers. And we have a curriculum that covers responsibility, accountability, confession, repentance. Guess what? Forgiveness, reconciliation, restitution. And I've gotten to witness men and women in prison change. And the core issue is typically forgiveness. And so about 8 years ago, I got invited to take over the organization. And so I'm the COO of Bridges to Life, and that's what I do every day. Wow. But in fact, I wrote a book, as you just mentioned, Betrayed by Choices. Yeah. But it is a story of murder, but it's a story of forgiveness and redemption. My dad was redeemed. Here's a great example. I'll quit babbling in a minute and let you ask another question. But we used to kid my wife and I that I would name our son James Buffington III. She's like, that is not happening. And so we named him Bryce. Well, my son and his wife had a baby 2 years ago. It's a grandson. And they named him Palmer James. And when he told me, I was like, oh, yeah, right. You're naming him James. And he goes, no, we're naming him James. And I'm like, after a sociopath, after a narcissistic killer, And he's like, no, Dad, James has been redeemed. And so
so good.
It's just been an awesome ending to our family story that my dad did change. And we all went through forgiveness together. And so the book is really our story. You hear from my brothers. You hear from our wives. You hear from my kids, my son and my brother's kids. And it's interesting. In the criminal world, you hear about the ripple effects of crime. We talk about the ripple effects of forgiveness.
Come on.
Tune in next week for part 2 of Forgiving a Murderer on the BetterMan podcast.